Recently I played some very refreshing, very original war games based on new ideas, but after a while I started feeling the desire to go back to the classic concept, to some good old school hex encounter war game. So it was a pleasant surprise when the Dark Sands showed up on my doorstep. It is a new game by GMT. It is by the same designer of the Dark Valley, and actually it is in a sense the sequel. It is based on the same mechanics, and if you watch my video for the Dark Valley, you know that I like that game, so this one was really promising. On top of that, this is a game about World War II and about the North African campaign, which is one of my favorite topics in wargaming, so a lot of interesting concepts here. This is a game that covers the North African campaign from 1940 to 1942, so we have Italians and Germans versus the Brits, and it is a two-player game, so these are the two sides that the players will control. It is a chit pull game, so as you know, possibly from this kind of game, this is a kind of game that is very friendly to the solitaire player, because there's a lot of uncertainty, and so you can play both sides at the best of your possibilities and still have a lot of surprises, a lot of things happening that you did not expect, and that results in a lot of interesting problems that you have to react to every time that you mentally switch sides. Without further ado, let me show you how the game works. The map of the game is printed on paper. It is actually two maps, one here and one here. You overlap them a little and they form the entire area of the campaign 1940-1942. The two maps lay flat easily. You don't need a piece of plexiglass, at least I didn't use one. And as you can see, there are a lot of boxes out there, so a lot of good reminders, places where you can put reinforcements, different tracks, things like that, very practical. As for the playable area, you may notice that it is divided in three different sections. And, oh well, my seasoned wargaming friends, you may want to brace yourself, you may want to sit down if you aren't already. The three sections are not at the same scale. Yes, I said that. Basically, this area is at a larger scale, which means it shows things more up close, as opposed to these areas show things more at a distance. That means the stacking limits are different in this area. That means that movement and supply lines work in different ways in this area, because it takes more hexes to represent the same distance that it would take fewer hexes on the two lateral maps. I was as shocked as you are when I first read about it, but of course then the advantage is that you can have a game about North Africa that does cover the whole thing and yet gives you more detail where most of the action, or at least where the most exciting action is going to be, which is of course around Bardia and Tobruk. And gives a little less emphasis to the areas that you mainly will use to bring in reinforcements. You can still move from one area to the other still, but, well, again, after the initial shock, I really, really like this. This is a chit pull game. That means that there will be a cup that will act as a randomizer, and you will place a number of activation chits in the cup, and then these chits will be drawn randomly, and depending on what is drawn, different sites will activate and different actions will be available. Not every turn will have the same chits. In fact, you have here a very useful player aid that tells you which chits go in the cup each turn. This is a very smart way of giving you a sense of the overall strategic situation. For example, the effect of other theaters that are not on the map, but that may, however, affect what happens here in North Africa. So you will have commanders that come and go, different groups that will activate more often, less often, and things like that. Very interesting idea here. You will have two logistics chits that will always go in the cup every turn, and when one is drawn, then you assess the supply situation of the various units that are not able to trace a line of supply to a source will be marked as out of supply. And then you have some units, some chits that do not go in the cup, actually. They are the Supreme Commanders like Monty or Mr. Rommel himself, the Fox himself. And they are kept outside of the cup, and they can be played at will. There are also other rules that regulate which chits exactly go in the cup. But something that is interesting, in other chit pool games, when you draw a chit, that tells you exactly who is activated. Here you have a mix of different things. You have some chits that will act like that. They will tell you, for example, that all of the units that are within range of the 21st cores and that belong to the 21st core will be able to activate. So some chits will tell you who activates. But then there's also a number of chits that will allow you to activate everybody on your side, but only for specific actions. For example, if this chit is drawn, as you can see, it has combat on both sides, then the British player can perform combat with any and all of their units that are adjacent to enemy units. If this one is drawn with move on both sides, then the British player can activate any and all of their units, but to move only, not to attack. This one is double-sided, so when drawn, the British player can choose to move or to perform combat. There is also, just to give you a sense of the variety, another one that works similarly and gives you combat at a penalty or allows you a half move. So very interesting idea here, again, because as you can imagine, you have a lot of move and combat chits, you're gonna have better capabilities that you only have half move and combat at a penalty chits. Also, to prevent Lady Fortune from taking over too much, there are rules that tell you that, for example, you cannot have more than 2 chits of the same side, one after the other. The third one needs to belong to the opponent, and this is why you have the action chit record track. And so that then, for example, if we were to draw another British chit, we set it aside until we draw a German one, and so we don't break the rule of more 2 of the same side next to each other. Also, in a single turn, you cannot have more than 2 moves and more than 2 combats. And there are more rules that regulate how this works, but basically you have a very nice balance here between randomness and structure. Units in the game are represented by this kind of counter here. They're nice, clean, they're thick enough, they're standard GMT quality, which means good quality. You have infantry, you have tanks, combat assets that are used by the 2 sides to modify their combat effectiveness, and garrisons. Now, the Axis player will have Italian units and German units, and the units of the 15th and 21st Panzer Division have all sort of benefits to represent their incredible effectiveness. And here we have some examples of British units, garrisons, so they don't go anywhere, they don't do much, they're sitting there, but that's why they're garrisons. As for the numbers you see printed on the counters, the number in the bottom left corner is the attack factor, then you have the defense factor and the movement factor. But again, when you're moving, you must remember in the central map, on the central map, things work a little differently. Now, once you get the general idea and you see how the action chit system works, things are fairly, how can I say, classic. Things follow lines, rules that you're probably familiar with if you play games before. I mean, war games before. Nothing too extravagant. When you're moving, well, guess what? All the units that are able to activate based on the chit that was drawn will move or can move up to their full movement allowance. And that will be, the expenditure will be influenced by terrain. When you move next to an enemy unit, you're entering an enemy zone of control. Units project a zone of control in the 6 axis surrounding them. And you can move, and you have to stop immediately. You can move away next turn, but you cannot move from one zone of control to another zone of control directly. Which means you can play a little bit with the zones of control to create invisible barriers that are tough for the enemy to get out of. So movement is pretty much what you expect from movement in a war game. As for combat, again, things are fairly standard. And in fact, the combat is based on combat odds. You will total all of the attack factors of the attacker, all of the defense factors of the defender, and you will turn that into ratio like 2-to-1, 3-to-1, etc., etc., etc. And you have a player rate that you will use to resolve combat. Now, then you will roll a die, you will cross-reference the column that you're using, again, attack divided by defense. You will cross-reference and you will see the result. The mobile combat table is the one that you will use most often. There is another combat table, the assault combat table, which is used only, is available only later in the game. It's much more brutal, and I think the mobile should have been printed on top and the assault underneath. It just seems logical that the one that you use the most should be on top. I want to point it out because when I first started playing the game, I was using this one and people were getting killed much faster than I expected. I was like, wow, these Italians are really stronger than I thought. Until I realized that I was using the wrong combat table, so don't make that mistake. But there is a difference. In fact, this is much bloodier. This one is more about, well, there are more results that will push the opponent, the defender, to retreat, which is fine if you have kind of surrounded the opponent, and then the opponent will lose step, be forced to retreat through enemy zones of control. So it's one of those games in which, at least earlier on in the game, frontal attacks are not super efficient. It's much better to attack the opponent or inflict damage as the opponent is forced to retreat. As for the results, it's pretty much, again, what you expect. Attacker eliminated, both attacker and defender lose one step, defender retreats, etc., etc. And again, you can see the retreat lengths change on the center map. They're different from the east and the west. And yeah, you have some modifiers, some things like that. Actually, and again, players can play assets to change their combat factors. So terrain will affect their combat factor. Other things will affect the die roll. So combat factor will affect this. Modifier on the die roll will affect this. Actually, there is one thing about movement that I should have mentioned, which is unusual, which is extended movement. Units, as long as they don't start next to enemy, they don't end next to enemies, they keep moving on roads, trails, so they don't go in extravagant places, they can use extended move, which is infinite movement. Yes, you can go in a lot of places, which really allows you to zoom into the interesting areas of the conflict from wherever it is that you are landing. So you don't spend turns and turns just, okay, da 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 da, and next turn, da 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 da. I used to like this. There is a game by MMP Africa with a K in which you spend a lot of time moving reinforcements to where it matters. I guess I'm too old for that. I really like the idea of the extended move. It's not without a cost, because once you use extended movement and you move from one map to the other, you need to roll a die and take a check. And also you need to take a check whenever you're done moving. The check is taken by rolling a d6. If you roll a 5 or a 6, your unit is disrupted, and so you cannot use extended movement for as long as it has it. And most importantly, it has a pretty steep combat penalty. That means you can bring units from your reinforcement areas into the central area where it really matters quite quickly, but you may not be able to use them for fighting the turn in which they enter, which is also important. Otherwise, it looks like they just teleported from the Enterprise down into the battle, and it just looks weird. But you can get them close to where you want them to be, and then they're already there next turn. Also, there is an interesting choices there, because you don't want your disrupted units to be too close to where enemies can capture them or hit them, because they have a penalty in defense too. Victory conditions, they are based on slightly different things based on the scenario, but generally speaking, the most important thing to claim victory is control of key locations on the board. Let me tell you right off the bat, this is a superb game. At least I had such a good time playing it. I played the full campaign, solitaire. It took me the best part of the weekend, and it was a really fun weekend. Then I also, of course, had time to hang out with my daughters, etc., etc. But when I was by myself, I was here with Monty, with Rommel, with the problems, the logistical problems, and the dilemmas of the North African campaign, and that was fun. The game to me really strikes a nice balance. It's a really sweet spot between historical detail and playability. You really see the things that you know happen historically, not just the events, but also the dynamics, the problems. You see them come to life in a way that is just so vivid, it's just so intense. And I really think that this unusual decision that the designer made about the map, that really paid off. Because, well, you know what happens here, the front is so long, and if you're trying to capture it all in one scale, then the area on Tobruk is, what, 3-4 hexes deep. The Gazala line doesn't look like a line at all. On the other hand, if you have it that is detailed enough that you can really have that tactical sense, well, at that point, either the map is huge or you only have the air around Tobruk. Here you really get the best of both worlds. You get the sense of these reinforcements that need to be brought in and a sense of really long distances, but at the same time, where it matters, then you really get to see the detail. And there are just so many interesting things here. It really captures what I like the most in games about North Africa, which is, for example, the importance, the key factor of supply lines. The fact that south of Bardia you have bottlenecks. You have two bottlenecks because of that escarpment, which is not far from the coast. You have one obvious visible bottleneck, a corridor, precisely between the escarpment and the coast. South of the escarpment, you're like, well, you have a huge area full of desert, but it is still a virtual bottleneck because you still need to be as close as possible to the escarpment because, of course, if you're in the middle of the desert, then somebody can easily cut off your supply lines. And so you see these interesting movements as somebody is trying to go on one side of the escarpment, the other side may try to maneuver around it and maybe cut through it. And then in areas where you have a little bit of more room to maneuver, you have what I think of the double stacker, triple stacker sandwich, which is something that happened historically in North Africa, not in terms of meals, but in terms of like, well, I'm gonna try to get a little bit more deep in the desert just to go around you. But then some of your friends are gonna do the same to me, but then some of my friends are gonna do the same to you. And you have this multi-layer situation, which is exciting because, of course, is a very fragile front. At any time, one of my units may disintegrate and then you start going through it. But still, again, even if you do that blitzkrieg situation, then if you go too deep, too fast, then I may absorb you. So there is just this interesting tension that comes. And again, here the central map is detailed enough that you can actually see that situation. You can play with moving units around, maneuvering, playing with the zone of control. And in terms of gameplay, that is really rewarding, that is really fun. From the point of view, again, of historical Chrome, you have all that you want. In fact, I would say for some beginner gamers, there may be a little too much of that. But it's like a signature move of the designer that you have a lot of individual cases, specific rules, that add that little bit of historical detail, that flesh out the general picture. I mean, the three maps really give you the sense of the historical detail where it matters, around Tobruk and Bardia, and more like the large, quick brushstrokes on the sides. When it comes to the historical content specifically, from time to time you're like, I don't know, do we really need a rule for that unit that received replacement specifically? The Panzers do something special on every odd turn. I have to remember that. There is that other thing that happens. There is the unit that comes in one turn, okay, but is withdrawn the following turn. I guess historically accurate, but did I need to do that? Oh wait, then it's coming back soon later. You have all of these things that For a seasoned war gamer, we're used to that. We got the antibodies and we're fine. Actually, we may benefit from it. I see how that may not be a crowd pleaser, and probably there are beginner war gamers that could just have a ton of fun and get a really good sense of the historical events and have really captivating gameplay without those elements that to them they feel a little bit burdensome. It may also be that the game will look more complex than it actually is, because here and there I just had the sense that the development kept things a little bit nebulous. There are just things in the rulebook that are implied. Again, a seasoned war gamer will deduce those things, but there are things that are not explicitly said. Some things are only in the player aids and not in the rulebook. As I was reading the rulebook, I kept struggling, like, but what do you exactly do with these chits? It keeps telling me you move when you get a movement chit and you do the Monty thing and the Rommel thing. What is this thing? And maybe I'm just silly, but it took me a while to figure out that it was on the back of a player aid that explained all those things. With a little bit of patience, with a little bit of patient perusal of the player aids, you can figure it all out. It's not hard. My point is that probably with a little more efficient development that had made the general layout of the information a little more streamlined, I think the game would, I wouldn't say it would be more accessible. It would be clearer that the game is accessible to beginner war gamers too. So a beginner war gamer will have to be a little more patient, maybe spend some extra time on the forums of Console World, on Board Game Geek, to get a little bit of a general sense there. I hope that my video, the main segment of my video, gives you a general introduction, because this is a great game. There's just so much fun to be had. You really have, if you play the whole campaign, you have the sense of the epic span. The situation really changes from the small confrontation between easily defeated Italians, but the British are gonna take a little bit, some minor damage in there, but then that may count when the Germans come in, and then you have a much larger action towards the central part of the game. But at the same time, the game remains manageable. It's not a monster, so the number of units on the board, again, really sweet spot. Enough that you can do fun stuff maneuvering them around, but not too much it becomes overwhelming. In general, an absolutely excellent game. I think seasoned war gamers won't have any problem or very little problems playing it, and they're gonna have a blast. Beginners war gamers can still have a blast and a half. Just it's gonna be a little more work for them, I believe, to get started, because this is a game that can be played by beginners, but again, motivated beginners, I believe. In general, Dark Sands is an excellent game. I'm really happy they played it. Has such a good time playing, and I can't wait to see where the system goes next, because the designer's notes tell me that there will be more games based on this system, and I can't wait to play them, because Dark Valley was good, but Dark Sands is even better.